The smell of burnt tallow and stale ale hung thick in the air of the Tabard Inn, a tavern nestled just across the Thames in Southwark, London. It was April, and the soft English spring had finally broken the relentless chill of winter, drawing a certain restless energy out of the walled city. Around a long, scarred oak table, beneath the flickering, spitting light of a dying hearth, a disparate collection of travelers had gathered. They were 30 individuals, representing every layer of the rigid, segmented strata of 14th century English society. Yet, they were united for a brief, strange moment by a common road, a shared, profound urge. This was no ordinary gathering of merchants or soldiers, but a congregation of pilgrims, readying themselves for the road to Canterbury. The visual atmosphere inside the inn was one of rich, heavy contrast. Dark timber beams crisscrossed the low ceiling, catching the faint reflection of the fire. The light did not penetrate far, leaving the corners of the common room wrapped in shadow, where the low murmurs of conversation and the scrape of wooden mugs against the table could be heard. The clothes of the pilgrims varied wildly, painting a vivid picture of the age. There was the knight, his tunic still bearing the dark, rust-colored marks of chainmail. He was a recent returnee from some distant, violent crusade. His armor was dull, his demeanor humble, yet possessing an undeniable weight of authority. Beside him, the monk, dressed in expensive furs, had a head glistening with sweat. He laughed too loudly at a coarse joke, his girth straining the finely woven fabric of his habit. His presence, so clearly defined by excess and worldly pleasure, was a blatant visual contradiction to the spiritual oath he had taken. A palpable heat radiated from the central fire, mingling with the earthy scent of drying mud carried in on the boots of the commoners and the heavy, sweet perfume worn by the wife of Bath. The pilgrimage itself was defined first by devotion. It was a journey of penance, of seeking divine intervention, or of rendering thanks for prayers answered. Yet, in the tumultuous, changing landscape of medieval England, this sacred act had been expanded, perhaps even corrupted, into something far more complex. The Canterbury pilgrimage was, fundamentally, a social phenomenon. It served as a rare, temporary melting pot where the strict sumptuary laws, which legally dictated what fabrics and colors each class could wear, could be subtly relaxed. Here, the tightly held social hierarchies could be momentarily blurred. For the knight, the pilgrimage was a formality, a return to moral order after a lifetime of sanctioned violence. For the poor, devout parson, it was a continuation of his life's mission, a simple act of faith. But for others, including the successful merchants, the ambitious lawyers, and the notoriously sensual wife of Bath, the journey was defined by a specific and urgent need for connection and release. They traveled not just for St. Thomas Becket's tomb, but for the company, the novelty, and the sheer pleasure of being unbound from their ordinary lives, at least for a season. This desire for escape, this primal human need to witness the world and be witnessed by it, lies at the heart of their journey. In a world built on rigid adherence to divine and feudal order, their journey revealed where the true, raw, and often ugly facets of human nature resided. The context of this gathering was anything but stable. It was the tail end of the 14th century, a period often referred to as the late Middle Ages. This era was characterized by profound social, political, and epidemiological upheaval. The memory of the Black Death, which had ravaged England a generation prior, remained a dark stain on the collective consciousness. The demographic catastrophe had upended the feudal system. It created a desperate shortage of labor and granted the surviving peasantry a terrifying, unprecedented degree of economic leverage. This shift was the root cause of the social mobility that allowed the new, wealthy urban classes to rise, These included the bourgeoisie, the moneyed men, and the successful artisans, who challenged the old guard of the aristocracy and the clergy. Visually, the land they were leaving behind was London. It was a dense, grimy, yet vibrant center of this transformation. It was a place of high drama and low politics. The reigning king, Richard II, ruled precariously. His later years were marked by a disastrous arrogance that eventually led to his deposition and murder. The political climate was thick with tension, violence, and the conspicuous consumption of the wealthy. The wealthy urbanites, technically beneath the nobility, often lived lives of greater luxury. They imported exotic silks and spices to mimic the aristocratic lifestyle, a direct affront to the structured social order. The sound of this era was a blend of pious chant and market clamor. The bell of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out the canonical hours, a steady reminder of the church's authority. However, this sound was increasingly interrupted. We heard the loud, confident haggling of the rising merchant class. There was also the clatter of carts carrying goods through the narrow, sewage-stained streets. And the common tongue, Middle English, was steadily asserting its dominance over the courtly French and scholarly Latin. The central figure orchestrating this human tapestry was Geoffrey Chaucer himself. He was a diplomat, a bureaucrat, a poet, and notably, one of the pilgrims. His work, the Canterbury Tales, stands one of the first great monuments written entirely in the English vernacular. To understand this work is to explore a profound literary concept. It is the capacity of everyday language to capture the full spectrum of human experience. This ranges from the highest chivalric ideal to the lowest, most vulgar farce. Let us define the core concept of the pilgrimage as it appears here. The pilgrimage, as conceived by Chaucer, is an organized journey. It is often undertaken for religious merit, involving travel to a sacred site. In this case, it was the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury. Historically, it was a key social institution in medieval Europe. It allowed for the temporary suspension of the ordinary routine. It also facilitated vast networks of hospitality and trade along the routes. Chaucer employs this framework not merely as an act of piety. Instead, it is a literary device. It is a narrative container designed to force diverse social elements into intimate contact. The act of storytelling then becomes the main event, transforming the spiritual journey into a profound psychological one. Imagine the long, dusty ribbon of road leading east from London. The group travels not in a somber, silent procession, but as a boisterous caravan. See the knight erect in the saddle. His demeanor suggests a quiet, internal devotion. Contrast this with the miller, a hulking, loud figure. His very appearance, with a broad, red beard and a nose wart from which coarse hairs sprouted, is an offense to refinement. He carries a sword and buckler, not for defense, but perhaps to intimidate. When he rides, his voice booms, telling vulgar, tavern-level jokes. The road itself is uneven, demanding constant attention. The dust rises under the hooves. It coats the expensive robes of the prioress and the modest dress of the parson alike. The physical reality of the journey grounds the abstract religious intent in sweat, fatigue, and inescapable proximity to others. For the people of the 14th century, this journey was a dual undertaking of the soul and the body. The parson views the road as a direct path to holiness. It is a chance to set a moral example for his flock. He believes, with genuine humility, that if gold should rust, what should iron do? But for others, like the pardoner or the summoner, the journey is purely transactional. It is a business trip disguised as piety. It is a chance to sell forged relics or abuse their ecclesiastical power. All this happens far from the scrutinizing eyes of the bishop. They see the other pilgrims as potential marks, not fellow seekers of salvation. The human experience of the pilgrimage is therefore fractured. For some, it is a quest for grace. For others, it is a cynical exercise in manipulation. And for the wife of Bath, it is simply an opportunity for a lively, public adventure that reinforces her own hard-won secular authority. The Canterbury pilgrimage mirrors our own modern road trips or online social networks. It is a space where people are stripped of their usual professional masks, whether from the office or the factory floor. They reveal their true selves through casual interaction and shared storytelling. We still seek out these shared, liminal spaces, whether on a train, in a global travel forum, or around a campfire, to exchange stories and validate our existence. Just as the pilgrims used the tale-telling contest to judge each other's morality and wit, modern audiences use shared digital platforms to evaluate character, authenticity, and authority. This demonstrates that the human need to categorize and critique others remains constant, irrespective of the century. This tavern scene is the foundational moment, a snapshot of a society in dynamic flux. The rigid hierarchy of the past, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, is being undermined by new realities. These include the power of wealth, the trauma of the plague, and the revolutionary assertion of the common English language. These pilgrims carry more than just provisions. They carry the contradictions of their entire age, and it is in their stories that those contradictions will find a raw, unvarnished voice. The first promise of the journey, issued by the host, Harry Bailey, is a competition. The best story, told on the road, will earn a free meal upon their return. This seemingly innocuous wager transforms the religious trek into a literary arena, where the true purpose is not devotion, but the exposure of character through narrative. This is where Chaucer begins his profound exploration. The structural brilliance of the Canterbury Tales did not spring from a void. It was an evolution of existing narrative forms, most notably influenced by Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. This was a collection of 100 tales told by 10 young people escaping the Black Death in Florence. Boccaccio provided Chaucer with the frame narrative, stories within a story, a revolutionary mechanism for the time. However, Chaucer's approach was a radical departure. Where Boccaccio's tellers were largely uniform, young, noble, and largely concerned with romance and wit, Chaucer's tellers were violently diverse. They represented a perfect, asymmetrical cross-section of English life. The journey itself rooted in a pivotal, violent moment in English history, the martyrdom of Thomas Becket in 1170. The fundamental tension between secular and ecclesiastical authority in medieval society was the root cause. King Henry II sought to limit the church's privileges, particularly the right of benefit of clergy. This right allowed church officials to be tried only in ecclesiastical courts, often resulting in lighter sentences. Henry believed all citizens should be subject to the king's law. The immediate catalyst was Henry appointing his friend, Thomas Becket, to be Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry mistakenly believed Becket, a man of bourgeois origin who had served the crown loyally as chancellor, would prioritize royal interests. Once appointed, however, Becket transformed, fiercely defending the church's privileges. This led to bitter rivalry and public defiance. In a fit of frustrated rage, Henry famously exclaimed that no one would rid him of this turbulent priest. 4 of his knights, this as a direct order. The short-term effect was the confrontation on December the 29th, 1170, when the knights confronted Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. The visual scene was one of breathtaking, sacrilegious violence. Imagine the sound of clashing steel within the holy sanctuary, the terror of the monks, and the final, fatal blow delivered near the altar. Becket's murder shocked the Christian world. He was immediately canonized as a martyr. 4 years later, Henry II performed a public act of penance. He walked barefoot to Canterbury and submitted to a scourging by the monks at Becket's tomb. This act temporarily conceded power to the papacy and bolstered the church's authority. The long-term result was that Becket's tomb became the most important pilgrimage destination in England. It symbolized the enduring power of spiritual authority over temporal power. Generations of pilgrims, including Chaucer's collection of travelers, continued to seek the saint's intercession. The pilgrimage, therefore, served as a constant, tangible reminder of a moment when the crown was humbled by the cloth. This historical context makes the contemporary corruption of the church, so heavily satirized by Chaucer, even more jarringly ironic. The journey begins, but it is the language of the journey that truly elevates the work. This involves the revolutionary use of Middle English. Before Chaucer, serious literature, especially epic poetry, was primarily written in French, the language of the court since the Norman conquest. It was also written in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship. Chaucer, a man versed in both, deliberately chose the vernacular. This was the rough, evolving tongue spoken in the bustling markets and humble homes of London. To fully grasp the significance of this choice, consider the linguistic environment. Imagine the handwritten manuscript itself. Before the printing press, the text was a visual artifact, painstakingly copied. Latin and French texts often carried the visual weight of authority, appearing in formal script. Chaucer's Middle English, however, was visually dynamic. It absorbed French vocabulary while retaining Anglo-Saxon rhythms. This made the sight of the words immediately accessible to the emerging literate class of merchants and artisans. The poetry was meant to be heard, not merely read. Chaucer's use of meter, rhyme, and cadence was designed for oral performance. This reflected prevailing oral traditions of knowledge transmission. You can almost hear the wife of Bath's coarse, confident delivery, aristocratic tones of the knight, the sanctimonious drone of the pardoner, and the vulgar, lisping voice of the miller. The sound of the tales is a cacophony of social dialects, a sonic tapestry of the English people. The experience of the language was one of raw immediacy. It eschewed the smooth, polished abstractions of courtly French romance in favor of a tactile, grounded vocabulary. Imagine the smell of the forge, the touch of the soil, the weight of a purse. This choice brought the language closer to the everyday experience of his audience. Chaucer brought the narrative down from the ethereal heights of Latin theology to the gritty, physical reality of the 14th century. His language tasted of the English tavern and the common kitchen. It was robust, sometimes vulgar, and highly flavored with colloquialisms. It tasted of local ale, coarse bread, and strong opinions exchanged freely over a communal meal. This was a marked contrast to the rarefied, imported wine and sophisticated fare suggested by courtly French poetry. The smell of this language was of the common air, not the incense or the perfumed court. It carried the smell of sweat, honest labor, and the unvarnished realities of human desire and bodily functions. These were elements previous high literature had studiously avoided. By choosing Middle English, Chaucer performed a subtle yet profound act of literary democracy. He validated the common language as a vehicle for complex philosophical, social, and psychological inquiry. This choice allowed for the necessary frankness to explore the base human nature that defines the tales. This brings us to the core pattern that emerges from the pilgrims' interactions, the inevitable clash between social ideal and brutal reality. In a time when the feudal system demanded chivalry from the knightly class, austerity from the clergy, and simple industry from the peasants, Chaucer reveals the widespread failure to live up to these standards. The knight, for example, is the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, noble, experienced, and humble. His tale is a grand, philosophical romance concerned with fate and honor. This is the desired narrative of the elite. Yet, immediately following the knight, the drunken, coarse miller insists on telling a countertale. This fabliau is vulgar, slapstick, and entirely focused on cuckoldry and base sensuality. The juxtaposition is deliberate. It is a literary reenactment of social friction, proving the high ideals espoused by the ruling class cannot suppress the raucous, pragmatic, and often obscene reality of the common folk. From the multiple perspectives of the journey, we see this clearly. From the participant's perspective, that of the knight, he might see the journey as a necessary act of piety. It is a chance to cleanse his soul after the horrors of war. He seeks order, philosophical truth, and the quiet observance of social propriety. His tale is a reflection of this need for ordered structure and noble love. He is seeking ideal. From the observer's perspective, the commoners like the miller and the reeve see the knight's tale as high-flown nonsense. It is divorced from the daily struggle for survival and pleasure. To them, the journey is simply an opportunity to fleece others or secure a bit of temporary fun. They observe the knight's idealism with a practical, cynical eye. They know that while the powerful preach morality, they often practice vice in private. From a historical perspective, our modern view, we recognize this clash as the sound of a crumbling society. The medieval ideal, which viewed society as a unified yet subdivided body, where each person knew their place, was losing its structural integrity. Chaucer captured the moment when the old language of piety and hierarchy began to be overwhelmed by the new, vibrant, chaotic language of commerce, individualism, and raw human desire. The pattern clear. Reality is always messier, louder, and more compelling than the idealized framework imposed upon it. This inherent tension sets the stage for the true heart of the work. It is the deep exploration of human motivation and hypocrisy achieved through the masterful application of Chaucerian irony. The core of Chaucer's genius lies not in presenting simple moral lessons, but in creating profound ambiguity through irony. This irony is not merely a rhetorical device. It is a worldview, a way of acknowledging the world's contradictions without reducing them to simple binary oppositions of good and evil. Chaucer, the narrator pilgrim, often pretends to be naive. He reports the appearances of his fellow travelers without judgment. Yet the details he reports expose the stark, undeniable moral failures of the person in question. Let us apply a hierarchical concept expansion to this crucial concept of Chaucerian irony and satire. Chaucerian irony is a nuanced, mobile form of literary art. It functions through a disjunction between surface appearance and underlying reality. It often employs the voice of a supposedly innocent or simple narrator to report facts that are devastatingly condemnatory. Unlike didactic moralism, which explicitly tells the audience what to think, Chaucer's irony compels the audience to participate in the judgment. The effect is often described as that of a loving ironist. This is a writer who critiques the flaws of creation, not with the fire of a prophet like Dante, but with a cautious, skeptical affection for the entire, flawed comedy of human existence. The satire operates by inviting the audience to critically engage with the presented realities. By magnifying the specific moral lapses of the professional classes, particularly the clergy and the lawyers, who claimed moral or legal authority, practiced systematic exploitation. Imagine the scene as the narrator describes the monk. The narrator tells us the monk loves hunting, owns fine, expensive horses, and wears the best fur. He is also fat and shiny-faced, ignoring the strict rules of his monastic order, viewing them as archaic. The monk dismisses the text that says hunters are not holy men, responding that he was a right good fellow. He agrees. The naive narrator simply presents these facts as admirable qualities for a monk. The visual contradiction is staggering. With the sound of jingling bridles, the sight of luxurious clothing, and the smell of roasted fowl on a man who has sworn a life of poverty and silence. The irony lies in the gap between the narrator's professed admiration and the audience's inescapable knowledge that this man is as a complete moral failure, a betrayal. The monk's smooth, rich clothing acts as a physical metaphor for the spiritual rot beneath. The human experience, understanding Chaucer's irony, is complex. For the reader, it requires a constant double consciousness, simultaneously accepting the pilgrim narrator's surface description while intellectually rejecting it. This strategy reflects the psychological reality of living in a corrupt society. People in the 14th century knew their priests were greedy and their lords were often brutal. They lived with this contradiction, outwardly honoring the system while internally acknowledging its rot. Chaucer provides a sanctioned, public space for that internal, cynical awareness to be voiced through art, allowing the audience to feel both superior to the depicted corruption and empathetic toward the common, sensual human impulses that drive it. This irony acts as a subtle tonic, validating the audience's own secular wisdom against institutional hypocrisy. Chaucerian irony remains profoundly relevant today, particularly in our mediated, image-obsessed culture. We constantly encounter public figures, politicians, influencers, and corporate executives who present an idealized self while their actions, reported in detail by the media, betray their true motives. The irony lies in the gap between the curated brand and the reported reality. When a narrator today reports on a figure's ostentatious generosity, only to detail the tax loopholes they exploited, that is, Chaucerian satire at work, it forces the audience to engage critically, to look past the performance of virtue and into the messy, often corrupt, psychological reality of the individual. Chaucer teaches us the enduring, dangerous lesson that the story a person tells about themselves is often the inverse of the truth they actually live. This profound satirical framework finds its sharpest expression in two specific characters whose tales and prologues define the moral and social landscape of the pilgrimage: the wife of Bath and the partner. The wife of Bath, Alison, is the embodiment of secular, experiential wisdom, challenging the spiritual authority of the church. Her prologue is a sprawling, audacious autobiographical monologue detailing her life and, most importantly, her 5 marriages. Her monologue is a declaration of independence, a battle cry against patriarchal restriction. She states that experience, though no authority were in this world, is right enough for her to speak of woe that is in marriage. She opens by grounding her knowledge not in the abstract, celibate writings of the Church Fathers, but in her own, frankly carnal, lived experience. She knows the rules, the texts that insist women should be meek and subject to their husbands, but she sees only their hypocrisy. She acknowledges the biblical ideal of virginity, but fiercely argues that not all vessels are meant for honor. Some are designed for use, for pleasure, for propagation. Her body, her sexuality, and her relentless pursuit of marital dominance are her weapons. She openly recounts how she manipulated her wealthy, older husbands through accusations, deceit, and sexual withholding, ultimately gaining control of their property and their wills. She is the rising bourgeois woman, determined to carve out agency in a man's world. Her tale, a romance about a rapist knight who must learn what women truly desire, sovereignty, serves as her ultimate philosophical manifesto. She transforms the lofty genre of romance into a vehicle for radical social commentary on gender dynamics and the innate desire for control. If the wife of Bath represents the pragmatic, powerful voice of female secular desire, then the pardoner represents the pinnacle of male ecclesiastical fraud. He is a genius of hypocrisy, a charlatan who openly admits his scam. The pardoner's monologue is chilling precisely because it lacks any pretense of devotion. He boasts that he preaches so that he may win. He also declares that he will not do no labor with his hands. He is a master salesman of salvation, carrying a bag of what he claims are holy relics. He calls a pig's bone a saint's jaw, and a pillowcase the Virgin Mary's veil. The depth of his self-awareness is stunning. He knows he is a hypocrite, yet he has perfected the art of the sermon. He weeps and preaches against the very sin of greed, which fuels his entire existence. His technique relies on terrifying his audience with vivid depictions of hell. Then he offers them an immediate, tangible solution in exchange for coin. His tale is a story about 3 young men who set out to kill death. Instead, they find a treasure and murder each other over it. This story is not merely comic. As critics note, it is lethal. It is a powerful, masterful parable of gluttony and avarice. The irony here is multi-layered. The most morally bankrupt character tells the most morally devastating tale. His powerful, insightful critique of human greed is utterly hollow. It is merely a tool to line his own pockets. He is the ultimate meta-hypocrite, making a spectacle of his own corruption. Yet, he still manages to generate religious fervor. More importantly, money. He embodies the terrifying spiritual rot of the late medieval church. This rot fueled genuine populist fury. There was a profound tension and contradiction within 14th century England. Chaucer masterfully captured this tension. The feudal system, defined by the relationship between the lord and the vassal, the land and the labor, was under terminal stress. This led to explosive class conflict. The structural rigidity of the feudal system was a root cause. It legally bound peasants or serfs to the land and the lord. This combined with extreme economic disparity. As one 12th century poet observed, "Whatever the rich achieve, the poor pay the price." This created a massive, suppressed underclass. Their labor funded the conspicuous consumption and military campaigns of the nobility and the clergy. Political power, land ownership, and even access to justice were entirely stratified. This created an inherent and constant low-level friction. The immediate catalyst was the demographic shift caused by the Black Death in the mid-14th century. The massive mortality rate, estimated at up to half the European population, meant that labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Suddenly, the serf held unprecedented, though temporary, bargaining power. When the ruling class attempted to reassert control, they used legislation like the Statute of Laborers. This aimed to fix wages at pre-plague levels. As a result, economic frustration exploded into political violence. The short-term effect was the 1381 Peasants Revolt, also known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion. It was fueled by economic hardship, hostility toward corrupt officials, and the radical egalitarian teachings of certain clergy. These teachings were often associated with the Lollard movement. The revolt saw thousands of commoners march on London. They specifically targeted symbols of authority, including lawyers, judicial officials, and the church's administrative centers. They demanded the abolition of serfdom and poll taxes. The sight of armed, enraged commoners sacking palaces and executing the king's officials was a seismic shock to the established order. While the revolt was brutally suppressed and its leaders executed, the long-term result was significant. The memory of the uprising permanently weakened the structure of serfdom. It demonstrated that the ruled could and would violently challenge the rulers. For Chaucer, a man of the court, this event was a stark and immediate reminder of the volatility beneath the surface of English society. His work reflects this awareness of profound class tension and the fragility of peace. This is seen in his inclusion of characters like the revolutionary-minded miller, the virtuous, yet poor, parson. Chaucer's ability to capture this transition makes his work a profound literary document. He observes the rise of the middle classes. These included merchants, lawyers, and skilled artisans, who were the economic engines of London. He notes their ambition, their wealth, and their inevitable tendency to adopt the vices and pride of the nobility they sought to emulate. The Wife of Bath is a prime example of this emerging commercial power, married to fierce individualism. The immediate influence of the Canterbury Tales was instrumental. It helped establish English as a formidable literary language. English became capable of handling complex philosophical, psychological, and satiric content. Before Chaucer, English was often relegated to administrative or domestic use. Meanwhile, French and Latin dominated law, court, and academia. The inherent richness and capacity of the developing English vernacular was a root cause. This hybrid language, it was capable of blending the sophisticated vocabulary of French and Latin, grounded, earthy terminology. Prior to Chaucer, there was simply no single, unifying work that fully utilized English linguistic potential. This left English without a recognized standard or a canonical piece of literature. It could not compete with the works of continental poets like Dante or Petrarch. Chaucer's meticulous and voluminous body of work, specifically the Tales, was the immediate catalyst. It demonstrated an unprecedented versatility in Middle English. He moved seamlessly between genres. For example, from the high romance of the knight to the vulgarity of the miller. Also, from the spiritual allegory of the parson to the metafiction of his own tale, Sir Topas. This variety proved that English could articulate every conceivable human experience and literary mode. The short-term effect was the rapid and wide-eyed circulation of the tales in manuscript form. This reached the literate elite and the emerging bourgeoisie. Chaucer quickly became the most respected poet in England. His choice of the East Midlands dialect of Middle English, which was the dialect of London, effectively standardized the language. This laid the grammatical and lexical foundation for modern English. Copyists and subsequent writers recognized his work as a new and formidable standard. This cemented English as a serious literary medium. The long-term result was the canonization of English as a powerful and expressive language. Had Chaucer not written the Tales, the linguistic shift might have been slower or taken a different trajectory. His work provided the literary authority needed to challenge the cultural dominance of French and Latin. This ensured, when the printing press finally arrived in England, a great foundational work already existed in the native tongue. This validated the identity and collective voice of the English people through their own language. The wider influence of Chaucer's psychological realism and narrative structure extended far beyond his immediate contemporaries. It fundamentally shaped the trajectory of Western literature. In terms of psychological depth, Chaucer was arguably centuries ahead of his time. Previous medieval literature, such as morality plays, dealt in allegorical figures like vice, virtue, and everyman. These represented abstract concepts. Chaucer's characters, however, are fully formed and contradictory individuals. They display signs of what we would now term self-consciousness and depth psychology. From the perspective of the medieval audience, they would recognize the allegorical elements in the characters. For example, the pardoner represents the sin of avarice, and the parson represents true piety. Yet, they would also be struck by the specificity of the characters. The pardoner is not just avarice. He is a specific, effeminate, talented charlatan who knows his game. He is a person they might recognize standing on a street corner. This blend of type and individual was revolutionary and profoundly engaging. Later writers, particularly those in the Renaissance, looked back at Chaucer and saw a precursor to modern characterization. William Shakespeare, the towering figure of English literature, directly drew inspiration from Chaucer. His play, The Two Noble Kinsmen, is based on Chaucer's Knight's Tale. This proves that Chaucer's narratives remained rich source material centuries later. The capacity for characters, like the pardoner, to articulate their own destructive inner logic is seen as a direct forerunner to Shakespearean villains. For example, Iago, whose honesty is merely a mask for calculated malice. Literary scholars today understand Chaucer as a critical bridge. He took the episodic nature of the frame narrative and imbued it with a psychological realism that hints at the coming of the novel. The tales are not merely a collection of stories. They are a study of the storyteller. The tales reveal the teller, a foundational principle of modern narrative. Chaucer's profound understanding of human motivation, from the knight's repressed trauma to the wife of Bath's sexual empowerment, established a new bar for the representation of complexity in literature. This moved well beyond simple moralizing. Perhaps the most potent and enduring implication of the Canterbury Tales lies in its close, yet often ambiguous, relationship with the burgeoning religious movements of the day. Specifically, it relates to the Lollards. Chaucer's sharpest satire is reserved for the religious professionals, including the friars, the summoner, the pardoner, and the monk. Their secularism and greed undermined the very foundation of medieval Christian life. This evolution of religious connects the literary world directly to the political crises of the era. The systemic corruption of the church was the root cause. This included the sale of indulgences and the practice of simony, church offices, and the extravagant, immoral lifestyles of many high-ranking clergy created a vast gulf between spiritual ideal and spiritual reality. This corruption was not subtle. It was highly visible and financially exploitative, draining the poor while enriching an already powerful institution. This set the stage for deep dissent. The immediate catalyst was the radical theology of John Wycliffe, an Oxford scholar and theologian. Wycliffe declared that the Bible, not the Pope or the church hierarchy, was the sole final authority on religious matters. He rejected core tenets like transubstantiation and the necessity of clerical celibacy. Crucially, he argued that the church's authority rested on the moral character of its clergy. He stated that if the clergy were corrupt, lay people should seize church property. The short-term effect was that Wycliffe's followers, known pejoratively as the Lollards, spread his doctrines across England. They championed the translation and distribution of the Bible into English, advocating for personal, experiential faith over institutional ritual. This movement represented a direct, organized, and dangerous challenge to both ecclesiastical and royal authority. It questioned the divinely sanctioned status of the church, which in turn supported the monarchy. The long-term result was that the Lollard movement was violently suppressed. Wycliffe's bones were exhumed and burned decades after his death as a symbolic act of condemnation. Yet, the seeds of dissent were sown. The Lollards created a sustained tradition of anti-clericalism and emphasis on individual conscience that persisted underground for over 100 years. Chaucer's satire, while not explicitly Lollard propaganda, aligned perfectly with the common grievances. It provided a powerful, culturally acceptable critique of clerical malpractice. The tales thus acted as a widespread cultural mirror, reflecting the same disillusionment that would eventually boil over into the English Reformation. The tales survived this tumultuous period because of their complexity. Chaucer's genius lay in the fact that he included figures like the parson, the virtuous, humble priest who truly practices what he preaches. This was to counter the corruption of the pardoner and the monk. By contrasting the genuine faith of the parson with the hypocrisy of the others, Chaucer avoids condemning the institution of the church wholesale. He simply condemns the failure of its practitioners. This nuance protected the work from the harshest censorship, while allowing its radical critique to flourish. We now stand at the cusp of the 21st century. Looking back at texts written over 600 years ago, it makes us wonder why this long, unfinished manuscript about a dusty road trip to a saint's tomb continues to resonate. The endurance of the Canterbury Tales lies in its unflinching, raw confrontation with the fundamentals of human nature. This confrontation remains startlingly relevant in our own fractured, transitional age. To connect Chaucer's medieval concerns to our modern reality, we will use the strategy of contextualization. The central themes explored by Chaucer, greed, hypocrisy, and the tension between performance and reality, are the pillars of modern social discourse. Consider the pardoner's trade, the sale of fake relics. Today, we call this a sophisticated form of fraud or fake news. It is often seen in the digital sphere where individuals market false remedies, conspiracy theories, or idealized personal brands. The pardoner was the original con artist of salvation, preying on fear and desire for quick absolution. His modern equivalent can be found in the multi-level marketing scheme promising instant wealth, or the social media influencer selling unattainable affection. The mechanism remains the same. It involves a powerful performance, an emotional appeal, and a purely financial transaction disguised as something spiritual or uplifting. Furthermore, the wife of Bath's struggle for sovereignty against patriarchal texts is the continuing battles over gender roles, bodily autonomy, and equal representation in boardrooms and governments. She was a woman using economic power to gain personal agency. This theme defines modern feminist discourse and the fight for equitable pay and power structures. The wife of Bath's claim her personal experience supersedes institutional authority is the philosophical foundation of modern identity politics. It is also the demand for lived experience to be validated, abstract, often privileged, ideological frameworks. Even the political tension between the knight and the miller, the high culture versus the low, the ideal versus the obscene, is enacted daily in our culture wars. We see the critique of the elite establishment, the Knight's Tale, being met with a powerful, vulgar, and populist counter-narrative, the Miller's Tale. This seeks to tear down pretension through sheer comedic force. Chaucer teaches us that this conflict is not new. It is the perpetual, necessary dynamic of a society struggling to define itself between aspiration and appetites. The tales suggest a continuous, cyclical trajectory for human behavior. They show us that while the external mechanisms of society change, from feudalism to digital capitalism, the internal human motivations do not. Greed will always drive the exploitation of faith. Sensuality will always challenge rigid moral codes, and the desire for social status will always breed hypocrisy. The enduring power of the tales ensures their relevance for future generations, not as an academic relic, but as a practical guide to decoding human behavior. As the political landscape continues to fracture and institutional trust erodes, the need for Chaucer's ironic skepticism grows. Future readers will continue to return to the Tabard Inn, to find a clear mirror, reflecting their own era's specific brand of vice and virtue. The open-ended nature of the tales never finished the promised number of stories itself suggests that the human journey of discovery and moral assessment is ongoing and incomplete. The road to salvation, or even simply self-knowledge, is eternally being traveled, and the stories along the way will forever be mixed, some noble, some base, some pious, and some horrifyingly cynical. The collective act of storytelling is the only constant. The journey to Canterbury was, for Chaucer, an inquiry into the state of the English soul. He began with the question of where piety resided and ended with a profound, ironic understanding that the spiritual and the vulgar are inextricably linked. The characters, stripped of the pretense of their stationary lives, reveal their truest selves in the